responsibility as the MC is to turn the podium over to my colleague in the remainder of the program. And it's someone that needs no introduction, particularly in this audience, but with that said, I'm going to forge ahead and introduce her anyhow. And the reason I want to do that is because Hope Olson is a very important person intellectually in my life and personally in my life. She's not only a wonderful colleague and friend, but astonishingly, she's my former student. I was her dissertation advisor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the early 90s. I'll tell you my first encounter with Hope. I had been at the university for a relatively short time, maybe 3 years, and even though I came to the university with tenure as an associate professor, I was hurriedly trying to complete research to be promoted to full professor when the director there, James Robbins at the time, came to me and said, we have a doctoral student starting at the university here in the fall, and she's a TA, and we are going to assign her to you. And I thought, oh great, this is all I need right now is to take a doctoral student under the wings when I have other things to do, which I thought at that time were far more important. And so I went to her student records just to familiarize myself with her, and I looked at her official transcript and her application. I said, I'm in trouble. First of all, she had perfect GRE scores. I don't mean high GRE scores. I mean perfect GRE scores. So I said, I'm really in trouble. So she arrives onto the campus, and she's going to be my TA in my retrieval class. And in a very short time, I realized that she was just a wonderful, wonderful person, and it was going to be very easy to work with her. So I thought, until she approached me and said, I think I have an idea for my dissertation. I said, oh, really? Well, let's hear it. She said, well, I want to look at this idea of naming. And hence, of course, you know where that goes, because the power to name obviously results from that dissertation. But she went on to say, and I think I have an approach, and that approach is going to be binary notation and feminist theory. And I said, I'm really in trouble. So with that said, let me turn it over to Hope. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay for the remainder of the program. I'll stay to the first part of the panel. And I'll leave you with a cautionary note as you head back to your homes. Remember that many pieces of luggage look the same.
We're trying to get together enough that one video shot can capture us all. So we're going to, we do like each other, but we're going to have to sit really, really close together in a
We've got one more panelist coming, but maybe I'll just start with some background. Yeah. Okay, first of all, I want to do for my first official thing to thank Ed for facilitating us all the way through the last 2 days. I think it's been very helpful and very elegantly done. Okay, I just want to put this slide up for a little bit. First of all, so you can see who's here, but also to look at the keywords in the title, because we picked those fairly carefully. And I think you'll find that we gradually touch on all of them as we go along. We're not going to be talking for very long. We'll be introducing some concepts and some issues. And then we hope to open it up for a general discussion. I think that there are enough opinions in this room that we could go for a long time. We officially go till 3:30. At the end, we may want to take a little time to think about what our next step is. There's been a lot of discussion about maybe having another conference of some kind. And so we'll gather some ideas about that at the end, too. In looking at this title, Trust, Authority, and Power, and the intersection of IO professionals with user standards and institutions, you can see we tried to pack a lot of potential in so that you can talk about almost anything. But the idea for this came first from someone, I don't even know who it was, who sent her lately a message suggesting we talk about the deprofessionalization of cataloging. And we felt that that was not the negative approach we wanted to take. Not that we can't talk about negative things, and that's important. But we decided we wanted to look first a little bit broader than just cataloging and also open it up to other kinds of issues. So the focus that we were aiming at was on information organization professionals. But going back to that original impetus, I wanted to just share with you real briefly an idea of work that comes from actually a feminist engineer named Ursula Franklin. And she talked about two kinds of technology. And when she talked about technology, she meant everything, not just the machines, not just the programs, but she meant the organizations, the procedures, the whole mindset around the technology. And she actually has a lot of interesting things to say, but I think this one's particularly pertinent. She talked about holistic technologies versus prescriptive technologies. And holistic technologies are sort of the artisan model, and this goes back to Joe's first assertion very nicely. And so that's where somebody really knows the whole process, the whole technology, and actually participates in all that and has control over it. Prescriptive technologies break up the work. And so often the person doing the work doesn't have the whole picture. And what I think is especially interesting is that she calls these designs for compliance. And so basically there's a loss of control on the part of the person doing the job. And I think that's what the deprofessionalization of catalogers is about in many respects. Because what that does, if you actually follow that model, and I'm not saying that cataloging has done that, but it puts the person actually doing the labor at a distance from the standards for that labor and the power to make procedures and processes happen. And so it takes away basically decision-making and judgment options. Now, I don't think we've slid all that far down that slippery slope, but I think it's kind of what sets a tone for that. On the other hand, Richard reminded us of Patrick Wilson's idea of exploitative power, where we've got something that we can actually apply. And so I think there is a certain positive power in that, in the hands of catalogers and other IO professionals. And that's the power that we're looking at trying to exercise. So I think we can think about a bunch of things. I'm just going to touch right now on authority and power, and other things will come along. But Joyce, the other day in her comment, reminded us of the notion of intellectual authority. I think the intellectual authority is one of the positive things that IO professionals can maintain. And there's a question that I think, again, will run through the discussion about whose voices get heard when we're setting things up. So we'll allude to that later. That brings in all kinds of things about standards and about institutions. And in institutions, again, you have to look at who's got the authority or who's got the power. And do they have a will to actually do things? A phrase that I like, that I think I made up, or maybe I read somewhere, is the idea of institutional will. You know, an individual can do certain things, but the institution has to have a certain will as well. Janet reminded us that management decisions are value decisions, and so that comes into that whole notion. So with that, I will introduce our panelists. They're going to each speak for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll throw it open. Okay? This is okay. 5 minutes. Okay. In order. Melody Fox is a doctoral student at the School of Information Studies who's focusing on information organization. She holds a master's degree in literature from the University of Illinois at Chicago and an MLIS from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She currently works as a Dean of Instruction at Bryant and Stratton College, where she helped develop a 4-credit required information literacy course geared towards students who find themselves below the digital divide. Her research interests include the social consequences of information organization. And then our next speaker will be Karen Coyle. Karen's a consultant covering a variety of areas of digital library development and management, including metadata and rights management. She also works with libraries to perform privacy audits of library services and systems. She's a member of the NISO Standards Architecture Committee. Our third speaker will be Tina Gross. Tina is the catalog librarian at St. Cloud State University of Minnesota, where she also teaches cataloging to graduate students in the Library Media Specialist program. She's done research on the effect of subject headings on keyword searching. That was Arlene Taylor. She's a volunteer index for HAPPY, the Hispanic American Periodicals Index. She's a contributor to a volume that you should all be familiar with called Radical Cataloging. If you haven't looked at it, go and find a copy. And she's chair of, how do you pronounce that? Salon, which is the Seminar on the Acquisition of Latin American Library Materials, and the Cataloging and Bibliography Technology Subcommittee. And then our fourth panelist is Steve Miller. Steve is the senior lecturer at the School of Information Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Before joining the school, he was about 15 years in the profession, mostly at the Golda Meir Library at Milwaukee, where he was an original cataloger and eventually head of monographs. Steve has done a lot of continuing education. He's done some consulting, and he co-chaired the Wisconsin Heritage Online Metadata Group. And he teaches in the area of metadata and information architecture. So with that, I will turn it over to Melody.
Okay, I'm going to be borrowing a couple of concepts from moral philosophy to sort of tie together some of the themes that have been discussed over the past 2 days. Because I'm talking about philosophy, for one, time requires that I have to be a little bit reductive. So any pure theorists out there may be offended by the way that I present some of this. And secondly, because I'm talking about philosophy, I'm going to read from my notes because it's very easy to talk yourself into trouble when talking off the cuff about philosophy. So I'm just going to get started, and I do have examples for this that may come up in the conversation, but if you need examples of what I'm talking about, please feel free to ask during the discussion portion. Two formal ethics are at work in cataloging or information organization that come from moral philosophy: an ethic of justice and an ethic of care. The ethic of justice was developed by Rawls and Kohlberg and values laws and rules that are considered fair and have been established through a normative process. In LIS and cataloging, we might recognize this as bibliographic control for the purpose of what Dean Ritz earlier called access. The rules, or bibliographic control, are there to ensure that all have equal access. The materials are available for finding. To provide access, catalogers apply standards that are purportedly consistent and normative or agreed upon by all. Catalogers rely on these rules and try to apply them accurately to provide equal access for users. As an example, AutoCAD shows that catalogers consider ethical situations, procedural situations, spelling things right, applying subject headings correctly, making sure that they're processing things in a timely manner. These are ethical decisions that are based back on rules and regulations. On the other hand is the ethic of care. An ethic of care arose as a feminist response by Carol Gilligan to the ethic of justice as it was interpreted by Kohlberg. The ethic of care considers individual situations, personal relationships, and context when faced with ethical dilemmas. Gilligan loosely associated gender with each ethic, and you can guess which way she went with each, but I'm referring to a non-gendered ethic of care later developed by Joan Tronto. In cataloging, the ethic of care manifests itself through a sensitivity to the user, a gesture that Gretchen Hoffman found missing in her earlier presentation. It means that knowing the context of the need and the limitations of the users, considering those in cataloging will help accessibility, what Dean Britz called accessibility. It could be considered the theoretical answer to Claire Bechtel's question of how we can serve the user, singular, and the users, plural, simultaneously. It serves the purpose of the reference librarian through the reference interview, who finds context, learns more about the user, creates a relationship with the user in order to more easily satisfy the need. The ethical question for us is whether bibliographic control, as practiced now using our current standards and access tools, conflicts with the social responsibility mission of libraries. Can we create a catalog that cares for us? The ethic of justice and care need to work in concert to provide accessibility over access through user convenience over cataloger convenience. Since we cannot throw bibliographic control out the window, the ethic of care can be demonstrated in developing our existing standards to have more cultural hospitality, to cause less violence, and the universality, the goal of universality values sameness, but a user-focused values difference, and our challenge is to find a way in practice where sameness and difference, objectivity and subjectivity are both valued.
And I'm going to talk about something totally different. So this is going to be one of those panels. I want to talk a bit about why and how it is that ethical decisions are so hard. And in many ways they're hard, and this has come up many times over the last 2 days, because we're trying to serve a very wide range of interests, needs. We have a number of different masters to respond to, and these can be in conflict. So in terms of who we're trying to serve and who we must respond to, we have first our users, then we have the library, which has its own interests. We may have the larger institution that the library belongs to, which again has its own interests, and any kind of consortial or other kind of collaborative relationships that we have, which have their own interests. In addition to all of this, as libraries, as a particular kind of institution in our society, we have a general level of responsibility toward the library ecology in general. We see ourselves, I think Janet brought this up very well, we see ourselves as being a kind of a sharing unit in general. Those who don't share are not contributing to that ecology. Some of us, those of us who are in public institutions and especially public libraries, have a particular responsibility toward the general public. As a matter of fact, if there is any institution that can represent the information needs of the general public, it is the public library and probably no one else. And we have this odd relationship with an undeterminedly long future that we try to serve. We also have a number of constraints. Money. There's never enough money to do what we want to do. It'd be nice to be fully ethical, but usually there isn't enough money to do all that you want to do. Technology itself can be a barrier to things that we want to do ethically, and not only the technology, but the fact that we work with particular vendors of technology. We have technologies that respond to the library situation that I think many of us have found aren't terribly flexible. And of course there's law and government. There might be things we'd love to do for our users, but it's forbidden by copyright law. One of the issues that comes up is users are starting to say, I want the library to keep track of everything I've read because I forget what I've read, and that conflicts with the privacy laws that we have. So we have a lot of different needs, we have a certain number of constraints, and then we also have the question of, well, who do you trust? Who can you trust to interact with in this environment? Oh, and I have down here that I should also mention Cutter, because otherwise you might not come up with it. So I'm going to suggest 2 cases. I'm just going to give broad outlines that I think might bring up some of these questions that we can discuss later if you're interested. The first one being Google Book Search and the settlement with the Association of American Publishers. Google Book Search was the result of some, I think, very brave innovation and risk-taking on the part of a small number of libraries, of academic libraries, who agreed to allow their works to be scanned, mostly for benefits that they would get, although there was some possible benefit for the general public and for the library world in general. And they trusted Google to take this forward as a strong partner and to support the interests of this being a fair use activity. This entire project has gone south. It has now become a lawsuit. It no longer is an agreement between the libraries and Google. There is still some chance that libraries will be served, but definitely libraries are being served in a very differential way. Academic libraries are being served, and possibly served in a much greater way than public libraries or school libraries. So the question is was this ethical? Was it just bad luck? And do libraries have an obligation to take into account possible wider effects when they take this risk? Or is it a good thing to take risks because we need to move forward? Another one that I'll bring up is OCLC, and I'm not talking about the OCLC policy, but I'm talking about the intent, in a sense, of the policy, which is the intent is to ensure that this collaboration continue and move forward and to prevent any dilution of its potential. And the question here, I believe, is to what extent are OCLC members obligated to try to ensure the continuation of this consortium, of this collaboration? Are they obligated to do so even if, for example, a better technology arises elsewhere that would benefit their library or a small number of libraries? Are the members obligated to support OCLC through everything and anything, or do you have a choice to be the first one to break something that has worked for a long time? So I'll leave it there.
Okay. So I'm representing sort of the practicing cataloger on the panel, and so I'm going to try to begin by talking sort of very concretely about the ethical dilemmas that I encounter in my day-to-day work and sort of throw out some of those issues. And so the first thing that I wanted to talk about was about the identification of users and what are my obligations to what users, because at the particular university where I work, there's one concrete example that I think exemplifies this really well, which is at St. Cloud State, we have a collection, it's called the Joan Blaska Collection. It's named after the emerita professor who founded it. And it's a collection of children's books that deal with disability and illness. And it's a very small collection. A lot of the holdings are unique to our institution, at least in terms of OCLC holdings. I think that a lot of them may be held by school libraries that aren't necessarily in OCLC, but so there are a high proportion of this collection relative to the rest of the stuff we get that I'm doing original cataloging, contributing records to OCLC. Now, in my institution, this collection is primarily intended for students in the School of Education who are studying to become educators. They're adult users, and so these materials are going into an academic library, so I assign Library of Congress Southern headings and Library of Congress classification, and I'm, in terms of my direct user base, I'm trying to devise the records with that set of users in mind. But at the same time, I can't help but be aware that whatever record I put into OCLC, once it's there, it's going to be the one that's used by all kinds of other institutions that have completely different needs, that vendors that go on to sell this book to school libraries are likely going to capture the record that I use. And so the question of whether I should be also adding Sears headings, children's subject headings, should I take that responsibility on because it's not obvious that there's anyone else who will be in a position to do it. But at the same time, that's not a direct part of the mission of my university, and so that's something that I really struggle with in terms of what's the right thing to do. And I think the answer that I come up with may vary from day to day depending on what my workload is and how frantic I'm feeling and that sort of thing. Okay, so I also wanted to say something about standards, and a lot of the frustration that I feel In that, of course, the standards that we have are what allow our tools to work, and they're what allow us to have shared cataloging, but at the same time, their current state is really problematic and inadequate. And as an individual cataloger at an institution, like, I can't just one day stand up and say, I'm done with MARC. That's it. I'm not using it anymore. That's just not how it's going to work. And another example is that when I came to the institution, I had to did a lot of work to get us into NACO because I had done it at a previous position. And in fact, this collection that I made reference to, right, these children's authors, there are not a lot of libraries out there doing authority work, for the names of these people, so it seemed an important contribution. So, however dissatisfied I am with the current way that authority control differentiation is done, the fact that the differentiation is based largely on appending the birth date of the author, I mean, that just pains me to the core. But at the same time, it's not, in my day-to-day work, that's not something that I can really play a role in changing. So that it opens up the question for me of, there are large areas of what I do where there's really not a whole lot of space to affect any change or to act ethically, at least in the way that I would like to. And so I spend a bit of time thinking about what are the areas where there's space for me to make an ethical contribution or to grapple with these issues more largely. And so I think in terms of practicing catalogers, the most common approach and the one that people are most familiar with is making local enhancements and customizations, particularly adding increased subject access to individual records. And while that's something that I do, and I even encourage my staff to get involved with it, the paraprofessionals. I mean, they're empowered to do that too at my institution. But I think at some point it's important to question the sort of individual approach versus the collective, because you can put as much effort as you're able into this sort of piece-by-piece approach, but that doesn't necessarily change the broader context, and I think there's such a crying, desperate need for that to happen. So another ethical dilemma is, to what degree am I able to actually participate practically in the collective deliberations about standards that actually do exist, however limited they are. And it's an ethical dilemma for me because I have not read the entirety of RDA and commented on the drafts. I did not make a contribution to the working group on the study of bibliographic control. I mean, it's just really hard to find time to do those things. And I'm actually sometimes riven with guilt about my inability to find time to do these things, because I do think it's important and necessary for practicing catalogers to forge time to do those things, and I'm going to sort of return to that in a second. And the other thing is to engage in research, which I have done a little bit of, which I'll get into in a second. But I think that the dilemma in terms of that is sort of what are the goals? Because I think the research that practicing catalogers tend to engage in often tends to be of a defensive nature rather than a sort of the kind of study of user behavior and user needs that we really need. And I think, and I'll use myself as an example, although I think there could be lots of examples, is that I, in the introduction, Hope made reference to the study that I did with Arlene Taylor a few years ago, which was about users. It used transaction logs to use actual search terms used by users to determine in their searches what proportion of the records were retrieved because of the presence of subject headings, specifically LCSH. Now, and that was largely in response to a lot of the criticism, well, not the criticism, but the suggestion that LCSH should be abandoned in the complete absence of anything that would replace it that would actually be better. And so it occurred to me that there could be a misinterpretation of that sort of research as if it were actually defending LCSH as it currently exists, even defending specifically the terminology choices that exist in LCSH. The idea that interpretation could exist completely horrifies me, as if it was some kind of Viva Cookery and Pictorial Works, which is completely, not even, that would not be a valid interpretation of my view at all. But I think that so many of the calls to change traditional cataloging have consisted of attacks and of things being taken away rather than any kind of actual progressive agenda to make things better, that I really feel like the water has been muddied in terms of how we can move forward, because so many practicing catalogers do view with suspicion criticism of traditional cataloging as if its only goal is to sort of stamp it out rather than to actually have an agenda that provides the progress that we need. And so, I think that all that stuff is a really big dilemma and what kind of research we should be involved in. Okay, and one final sort of thought is that I also think about what kinds of actual activism is it possible to be engaged in. Not just sort of stuff in the direct day-to-day job, but things relating to the more outside world. And one thing I want to assert is that what's happened with the OCLC records policy, I think is really nothing short of a popular revolt in all kinds of different corners of the library community. And how successful that's going to be ultimately in getting them to change their direction, I think is an open question that we should discuss. But I think that building that sort of momentum is really critical. And related to that, I hope people are aware, last year, at the end of the year, in Philadelphia, there was an announcement that a bunch of branches of the public library system were going to be closed because of budget constraints in the city. And a sort of popular grassroots movement rose up with people organizing marches in their local communities, attending town hall meetings that the mayor was sort of forced to call, and that were intended to provide a venue for people to blow off steam and to kind of contain the issue, but actually were turned into a means for people to put so much pressure on the administration that the decision had to be rescinded. And how that happened is relatively complicated, but I think that I was so inspired by that. It was so amazing, and I think that one thing that's relevant for catalogers and our community in general to think about in that is that a lot of what people involved in that were saying was a rejection of the budget priorities, right? Of the city saying, we don't have the money for this, and the population saying, we know you do. You're going to find it. Your tax cuts and your stadiums, all that stuff, that people actually making an assertion of what things are worth resources. And a friend who attended some of these events told me that one of the things that the protesters chanted was, they say cut back, we say fight back. And I love that. I think that we need a lot more of that spirit in our field. And I'm not saying that, that whenever we're facing budget cuts that it's feasible for us to sort of organize a street demonstration. But I do think that those developments in society, the fact that a lot of people are looking at the broad priorities of why are there millions and billions of dollars available instantly to go into bank bailouts, and things that are public needs, are constantly struggling for funding. Like maybe the restraints that we received are not immutable, but are actually susceptible to being challenged, and that there are priorities of people with power who are susceptible to being challenged. And I think that that those kind of things are things that we should be asking about and thinking about.
I'm going to speak also a little bit more from a practitioner perspective, and one of the things that I guess struck me through most of the conference was that most of what we've talked about has been cataloging related. There's been very little about other aspects of information organization, such as creating metadata in digital collections or information architecture work. So I'd like to bring in a little bit of that perspective, because I think a lot of the same ethical issues come up in those contexts, and a lot of the same tensions. So I thought I would ask a question. How many people here either work with or teach Dublin Core or MODS or the source of graphic materials or something other than AAC or 2RMR? So relatively few. which is kind of interesting. So my remarks may end up not having much relevance, but I'm going to say them anyway. I think the world of organizing digital collections outside of cataloging is an important area because our program and most of our programs prepare people to do that work also. And that can include metadata librarians working within libraries who may also do MARC cataloging, but also professionals working in libraries, archives and museums, and even in government agencies and not-for-profit corporations. And one ethical issue that struck me was, and I think this came up, and it came up partly in the Library of Congress, but the report on the future of bibliographic control, is the ethics of providing access to those materials that are unique and hidden, that are one of a kind, that only one single institution has. And that's what a lot of digital collections are about, and metadata for digital collections. So I think that that's an interesting aspect. And is there a certain ethical priority, perhaps, to provide access to those, because those are things that are not going to be found in Amazon, that other libraries are not going to be cataloging. A lot of issues come up in even the cultural heritage metadata sphere about training, background, adherence to standards, institutions, authorities, and those types of topics. And one of the things that I find very interesting in the world of metadata and information architecture is it's almost the opposite in some ways of cataloging, in that there's more of an emphasis on user-centered design, on really tailoring metadata elements very often for a specific audience, a specific set of users, and for the specific collection. And also often creating your own control vocabularies for local needs. But that can become in tension then with the issue of interoperability of that metadata and the shareability of that metadata outside of the local context. And that's a major, major theme in the current metadata literature in our field, in librarianship. So there's certainly ethical dimensions there. Not only do you have the ethical dimensions of creating the metadata or cataloging, but also in designing the schemes and how you label things. What elements do you choose? What control vocabulary terms do you create originally? So all of those aspects of actually designing and creating. And that kind of touches on, I think, Hope's comments about holistic versus prescriptive technologies, and how kind of that metadata information architecture world, there is that more holistic approach going on. But there is that tension between then the shareability and the interoperability of all of that in a larger context. And that's where adherence to standards comes in. And there are often complaints that the metadata being created, and let me just step back a second, there's a huge, huge, huge amount of this work being done all over the place, in libraries, archives, and museums all over the country. And especially many of them that are smaller and medium-sized, that really don't have connections to a lot of the professional resources that a lot of us do. And I became aware of that in my work in the Wisconsin Heritage Online project. So there's a tension between this need for interoperable metadata that adheres to standards. Even something as simple as double and core, which is a very simple standard, many people will create metadata that others will say is not shareable, that doesn't adhere, that they have misunderstood the elements. And so there are issues of harvesting and aggregating all of that metadata into shared repositories, and then also its general interoperability on the World Wide Web and the semantic web and that larger context. So I'm just, I guess, raising that issue. And I guess a couple of questions is there an ethical obligation to create shareable metadata, people coming out of that context? Is that something that institutions should be thinking of? And what are the constraints on that? As I mentioned, a lot of the institutions are smaller. There are certainly technical constraints of using products like Content DM, which is the most widely used digital software package in the country, which also happens to be an OCLC product. But that puts a lot of constraints on what people can do. And also, who is I sometimes have questions of who's setting the agenda, what is quality metadata and shareable metadata, because when I read the literature, the books, the articles, when I go to conferences, I'm also a member of the Alex Metadata Interest Group. Almost solely the people are from large academic and research libraries, and they seem largely unaware of what's going on among smaller, medium-sized institutions. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of dialogue, and they also don't seem to be often aware of some of the limitations that really these people are under in terms of their ability to create more widely shareable and interoperable metadata. So that's my perspective. I just wanted to bring in.
Okay. So we're ready for your thoughts, contributions, suggested answers, more questions.
I'm going to throw something out going off of what Stephen just said. As Ed pointed out earlier today, a bunch of us are here from the University of Iowa, and we work in special collections work. And one of the things that I've come across is not only do we have to think about the user when we're developing metadata specifically for digital collections, but especially when dealing with 20th century materials, we still have to think of the subjects of that matter, especially if you're talking about archival content. So one of the things that, I work at the Iowa Women's Archives, and one of the things that we ran across was we had digitized a big group of photographs. And in those photographs, they were all labeled, they had everyone's names on it, we popped them up on the web on the Iowa Digital Library. One of the women who was in one of those photographs, she did not donate the photographs, but she Googled her name and saw her image online and got very, very upset and requested that all those photographs be taken off. So legally, in theory, the Women's Archives have no responsibility to take those off, but that definitely brings up an ethical issue of what do you do when these subjects are still alive and they're still very present and very concerned with their online image. So that's just another thing to think about that I wanted to throw out.
I'll throw out one to sort of counter that, because I think that's a very interesting question, but in the work that I've been doing with the Open Library, which is a project of the Internet Archive, we're just sucking in metadata from like anywhere, and it's like the rest of the Internet Archive. It's pretty indiscriminate. And one of the kinds of requests that we get is from authors who want us to remove the metadata for their book, even though we got it, say, from a library or we got it from Amazon, because for some reason they don't want it known that they wrote that book. And so at what point, are you obligated to remove that from the public record because someone who claims to be the author says they don't want it there?
I was just wondering if anyone from OCLC is here. Because, and I think that given the fact that they're the largest single vendor, the largest single repository of our intellectual content, that they should be concerned about the ethics of information education. And I'm concerned that they would be.
I'd like to just put a point into the starter here, so that we make some good rules. I think it was Janet who asked, why are there so few courses offered in library schools that have ethics as part of their aims? And I was thinking about this last night, and I wondered whether it isn't perhaps that, and I noticed this is my students, that if you say information ethics, the students read intellectual freedom. In the United States, information ethics equals intellectual freedom. Which I seems to me coming from the outside. It overshadows all other ethical discourse. Even if you look at the ethics case studies in management texts, for example, or their websites, most of the case studies seem to be about intellectual freedom. Now, important as intellectual freedom is, undoubtedly, what I've also noticed is that within the field of intellectual freedom, the sexy issues of fighting against banning of books seem to predominate all other discourse. a very large margin. And I feel that perhaps a negative effect of this is that the more subtle forms of threats or more subtle threats against intellectual freedom are being overlooked. And I'm thinking, for example, of the issues of bias in catalog indexes, which we'll be talking about today, but also things that are at a more sort of macro level. For example, the dominant role of major corporations such as Thomson Scientific in determining what is scholarly and scientific discourse and what is not, which is really, if you start thinking about it, pretty scary. So I think there's a whole dimension that perhaps we could tackle in the next conference.
I think too that there is a fear that of ethics as a philosophical subject rather than just a question of right and wrong. Someone said the other day, I don't know anything about ethics, so I wouldn't necessarily address ethics as a branch of philosophy in my work. I'm not sure if that's exactly what was said, but it was something to that effect, that I don't know anything about ethics. And I think that shouldn't stop the conversation. I mean, we're a little bit new to this discussion, but it shouldn't stop it in terms of asking those questions. Jen?
I think thank you for that observation, because it comes home to me. When I said in my talk that I spent a number of years, well, I may have cut this part out of my talk in the interest of time, I spent probably my first 4-year term on council, including a fair amount of wondering why all these people were spending all this time talking about intellectual freedom, and which I, of course, thought was a given, and we need to talk about it, and why are we not talking about other ethical issues that seem to matter to me? And I spent a long time getting acculturated into council, but I think one of the answers is that we are the minority. We are, I don't know what portion of the percentage, are engaged in knowledge organization or bibliographic control or whatever you want to call it, but we are by far the minority. So most of the people who engage in most of the discussions in most of this field know little to nothing about what goes on in bibliographic organization. So I was actually rather attracted to the thought of having a march, a protest march on behalf of cataloging or something. It was a wonderful visual image. I thought, okay, well, if we could bring in Rich's Moralia's legions of catalogers and we could have this march. But I think, and your question, what kind of protest, what kind of activism can you reasonably engage in? I think it's a really important question, because I think that it takes activism. We have to stand up in some ways. We have to figure out effective ways to communicate what matters in information organization. And information organization is the very center of this whole field. If we can't convey that to the field, we are in sad shape.
I think in connection to what Peter and others said, resource allocation to make work accessible also reflects ethical priorities. So I was just wondering how the panel experience or feel about that as an ethical issue. For example, if you're in an academic library and your management decides, well, we can outsource cataloging or we can spend less money, it's not that important because users, it's not that. So I think the decision-making process on allocation of resources has ethical dimensions. I don't know if anybody wants to. I hope you all agree with that, but based on social justice and justice of care.
I think it's a major obstacle to the ethic of care and the ethic of justice working together, because you can come up with many methods in theory of achieving the best access and the best accessibility, as you mentioned before. But if you come up against that brick wall of not having the money or not being able to work with the systems designers to create what you want, then where can you go? It is an ethical dilemma, but it's an ethical dilemma that someone else is faced with over you. If someone had talked about management as value-laden, management decision as value-laden, and I think that might be where that decision-making happen.
I think this comes up a lot too in the development and management of technology has been talked about quite a bit in our field, the way that people keep throwing technology at problems and taking money from some other part of the library to throw technology at problems. I mean, I see that a lot in terms of the mass digitization, which is a way, and the fact of partnering with Google because that was the cheapest way to do it, was a decision that is always justified as being because of the money, and yet it has some great ethical implications, and will have even more ethical implications when those libraries start deaccessioning some of those works because they now have a digital copy of it. So the combination of money and technology seems to be one that is, particularly has a very violent component.
The question of the ethics of resource allocation actually kind of ties in a little bit of what I've heard. And I love what you said, Tina. I just have to say that. Okay, thank you. But one thing that really came up during our visiting scholar program had to do with essentially the whole issue of Amazon limiting certain searches for adult content, and the protest, the grassroots protest that came up about it. But what really bothered me is that nobody talked about the fact that, in a way, Amazon, not WorldCat, not our online catalogs, not LOC, Amazon's become the default catalog for a country. And part of that really kind of bothers me. And I think that, they're also involved in information organization, but they're totally outside of our professional field. And you get things like that where their interest is not necessarily in access to information. Their interest is essentially increasing their bottom line. And there was a term I heard, like the corporatization, the privatization of information, and I think part of it, I see that in scholarly works where we basically outsource scholarly articles from university presses to these private presses, and now we're having issues with serious cuts and stuff because of the inflation rates. So, I don't know, I think that the resource allocations that were made at the time were very practical, and they didn't seem like that big a deal at the time. But I think we're seeing like these long-term reverberations of these decisions. And I like the idea of a protest. I'm always up for a good protest. But it also seems to me that we're much more likely to go to bat for our users over Patriot Act, over banned books, much more than we are for ourselves and for standing up for the importance of what we do.
If I may, one of the things that we've been talking about the past 2 days is the record, the value of the record, the quality of the record, what goes into the record. And we've ended up in a defensive position relative to the record. The challenge, if you go back and look at the history of the development of IT in the profession, the IT began with librarians and computer science departments coming together to develop information systems to assist people in discovering materials. So it was initially driven by practice and partnered with mathematicians and technical theorists. I mean, originally we were the solution. What happened was I have to go move my car. What happened is that the vendors commercialized themselves. All right? That's what happened. The vendors could no longer sustain themselves as partners with a nonprofit organization and had to become a for-profit driven company in order to continue to serve their initial partners, right? Many of us in this room remember that, haven't we? BTLS, Carl, Notice, all of them moved into the commercial field. Now, we no longer influence the development of the technology. And that's where the break is. The break is not that the records are inadequate, but that the technology is not exploiting the information that's in the records. And that's stopped. If we look at around 85, and when the studies, all those user studies were done about how to improve catalog interfaces to support the discoverability of resources, that gets swamped by what? The web. The web comes along, and all of a sudden, all of that research is rendered irrelevant. Because, and I remember talking to vendors about interface design, and they say, we no longer have to put money into R&D or research design because Google has resolved that question for us. So if you want better interfaces, you've got to design it yourselves. So we're defending the record. We don't need to defend the record. What we need to do is challenge the technology development. Why don't systems exploit authority control? I mean, I've been arguing this for 15 years. There is no reason why authority control why languages shouldn't map automatically and transpose natural language searches into controlled searches. It's perfectly possible. Technology is certainly capable of doing that. That hasn't happened. Why are we defending ourselves? Actually, why are you all defending yourselves? I'm the IT person. How many vendors are here? You know, OCLC isn't here. How many vendors are here? There are no vendors here. So that, I think, is a large part of what has to happen. The conversation needs to change and say, why isn't the technology being developed to exploit the product that we're creating? I got to go move my car. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say about resource allocation. It seems like we always put things above people and services, things and materials, and it's always justified. Well, salary retired, so we had to use that money to buy the new database. Well, of course, that makes sense. We had to do that. So how do we change it? It seems like people are finding things all over the place. I mean, there's stuff available everywhere. So how do we change it that, hey, libraries provide services, maybe we need to change our focus to be more service providers, and that's where we will add value.
Part of what, Tina, you said triggered this in my mind. Years ago, I worked at Chemical Abstracts in a department, part-time Chemical Abstracts in a department with about 30 or 40 chemists who literally read papers on chemical experiments and created chemical structures and so forth. And then one day, in the middle of this office, this complex of offices, there was a brochure of the new chemist in the department. And I remember this distinctly because I was standing right there. I had been reading this and noticed that one of them had been a doctor in the Army. I set it down. This individual came up with a big black magic marker and wiped out all of his information. Because to him, that did harm. On a very peripheral level. So we talked about for the past couple of days what the user needs, but we also have to be cognizant of what the user doesn't need, what the user doesn't want somehow.
There were two things that particularly struck me. And one was Steve's observation about the ethics of providing access to materials that are unique and hidden. Especially in light of Amazon. I worked for a small bookstore at one point, at the time when the big change was starting to really emerge. And what we were sort of starting to see that probably is even more prevalent now is that niche things that you wanted, those small hidden things, you couldn't get them because the big stores didn't stock them, and they were running the small stores out of business. And I think that that's something that just sort of needs to be thought of. But I think that the money quote, Tina, came from you when you said, why are there billions available for bank bailouts when public projects are going wanting? And you don't have to be a cataloger or information organization expert or anybody except just a citizen to be able to have a voice about that.
And actually, if I could just throw in something in response to that, because like there have been some questions in kind of response to the panel about resource allocation, and I really think what I was trying to suggest was not that we need necessarily to be more forceful in sort of an internal institutional struggle about how the resources that we are currently allocated are divided up, because I don't think that that would be a very effective strategy, but that like broadly we have to be engaged in questions of how our society as a whole uses its resources, and that I think, when I think about the kind of catalog or the future catalogs or catalog-like tools that I imagine, that I hope one day exist, the amount of resources that would need to go into their development is actually pretty massive, and I think that that sort of project that we want to engage in is sort of going to sink or swim along the same lines as education and healthcare and like all the other sort of big social needs that are currently devastatingly underfunded. And so I think, engaging in that sort of civic duty of like what are we collectively about, and what do we want to do with our society's wealth, and what kind of voice do we want to have, and how that gets, worked out.
And this fits in with the fact that public libraries are reporting a great rise in usage over the last 12 months, happening to coincide with the complete collapse of our economy. And that some of them are actually having special classes or having speakers come in either about how to manage your money or how to find a job, and they're having special resume sessions and people to help you write a resume. And to me, this is just so obvious that this is something that needs to be part of whatever this recovery is. But I have no idea if it's on a larger nationwide agenda, even though it seems like it should be.
We'll have representatives in Congress, right? Those of us who aren't from Canada.
Or Brazil.
Well, I think the question about why aren't vendors here is rather an interesting one, because I think, and I can come up with a number of possible thoughts about why that might be, but I wonder whether it's because the vendor community, the for-profit community, frankly, doesn't think that ethics has much to do with it, and or thinks that a conference on ethics and information organization would be way too esoteric to do it any good, that it would be a side point for them. And that by itself is an interesting problem, because OCLC, for instance, although it clearly wants to take over the world, would probably think that it had an ethical component, and surely it does, because it purports to be a member organization. So the larger question, I suppose, is how do you suffuse ethical concerns and considerations into absolutely everything we do and everybody we're connected with, so that they would think that they should be a part of this conversation. You notice it's only a question I haven't answered.
I would suggest that one thing is visit the booths at AOA.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that what you may have to do is actually specifically invite some, because they may not think of it themselves, but you get it started by inviting them, showing that you are interested in having them here.
Well, one of the reasons they would come would be to sell something. What would they sell to us right now?
An ethics checker.
A bill of goods.
I think it's interesting, the statement that so many of our vendors started out as part of our institutions and then broke off. And I hadn't stopped to think about it that way, but that's absolutely the case, that we created these systems, sort of, in a nonprofit environment, in a library environment, and then they break off, and then they seem to morph into some very different thing. And maybe what we have to do is keep them in and not have them break off. Maybe we do need to take more control over our own technology rather than outsourcing it to vendors.
One of the things I'm really interested in is this idea of profession, because while I think that it's really empowering, it's also very isolating. So I would love to hear some comments about how we can maybe take some of these principles and concepts and communicate them and help the non-professionals, the smaller organizations, grow the advocacy across people who aren't political. Or maybe is that even a useful thing to try to do?
Well, when we were starting to, now I can't even remember what meeting it was. I think it was when we were starting to work on the principles for the network society, but it could be a different meeting, okay? Because they all blend together. They were all in a room that kind of looked like this. One of the issues that came up there, which I don't remember how strong it came out in the end result, was the fact that we have to quit having a secret language. When I go around, and I work with a lot of non-librarians who are trying to work with library data, and I have to explain Ferber to them. And when I go around saying, work, expression, manifestation, and somebody the other day, and I can't remember what it was, but came up with like real normal human terms for those, it suddenly made sense to everybody. We really, continuing resources. There's another one. That's a real good one to throw out at a cocktail party. We have to talk in terms that people can understand if we want to be able to mingle with the rest of society, as opposed to just stay in the room with each other where we know what we're talking about. So part of it, I think, is finding a way to express ourselves that isn't quite so esoteric.
And that actually speaks to the catalog interface again, because as an expression of what we do, if everyone is out there using Amazon, understands how to use Amazon, and wants those advisory features like ratings and everything else, the search and find people, all this stuff, and we're trying to use something else that is more esoteric and difficult to use and defend it, it gets to be difficult.
Yeah, I'll give you I have some wonderful examples from my work with the Open Library. One of them recently was a person wanting to be able to create a separate sort of section to put series, to put everything in a series, whatever. And it turned out that what series meant to everybody there except me was Harry Potter, 1 to 7. That this, the acta morphologica, blah, 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 B, volume 123, no one even knew it existed. But everyone understood the series was something like Harry Potter or your favorite mystery writer who has the same characters that carry on. So
it's what we used to call LLC, the white series as opposed to a blue series.
A white series is the blue series.
The color cardstock.
Okay.
The blue series were the ones that you traced and classified.
And the white series
were the series-like segments.
Yeah.
I'd like to just inject a quite different element into this discussion, an international element. Perhaps it's something we can talk about in the future conference again. In 1992, I became the director of the State Library in Victoria, which was the National Bibliographic Agency of South Africa and became part later on of the National Library of South Africa. And we were responsible for compiling at that stage the National Bibliography, South African National Bibliography, and we also were the custodians, or recently had been the custodians of the South African National Union Catalogue, which had recently been handed over to Sabinet, which also started off just like OCLC and all these others as being a member organisation owned by all the libraries and later on commercialised. One of the projects that I inherited when I got there was the South African Mark Revision Project. Now, the SA Mark had been developed at a very early stage on the basis of Unimark. Some of you may know what Unimark is. It's an international mark format. It's an ISO standard. This had been done rather presumptuously by the South Africans, so they developed it before the Unimark standard had been finalized. So it was a little bit off kilter. And when I got there was a big project underway, quite expensive project, to completely revise the SA Mark standard. And about a year later, there was a big national conference of cataloguers held in South Africa and their managers, which decided they were not going to use SA Mark anymore because they wanted to go over to the United States mark format, simply because they were buying integrated library management systems like, for example, innovative interfaces and those kinds. And it simply didn't make sense for them to have to convert SA Mark records, or have a special program to convert SA Mark records into US Mark. This illustrates the dominance of, shall we say, it was unfortunate, of course, but it's not the end of the world, but it does illustrate the dominance of the United States industry standards in the world as distinct from the international standards of, for example, the International Organization for Standardization, which are used by many countries. One of the practical implications of this was that there's quite a lot of information that had been painstakingly compiled by SA&B bibliographers had to be deleted from our records. For example, SA&B catalogers had been adding dates to corporate authors. Now, dates, birth and death dates are added to the names of personal authors, but not to corporate authors. But we had been adding, our catalogers had been adding the dates of the births and deaths of the various government departments and government agencies. So South Africa was going through a phase of lots of constitutional changes. They also kept changing the names of departments dealing with black people, frequently for political reasons. And so it was actually very useful to the users to have those dates in there, but the rules said that you're not allowed to have dates in corporate authors' names, so they all had to be deleted before the records could be part of the database. What also happened was that SA&B joined OCLC, and basically it's little more today than kind of a subsidiary of OCLC. And the result was that the personal author headings that had been compiled by knowledgeable South African catalogers for African names in South Africa, or names of Afrikaans authors with particles and so forth, were being overwritten by some librarian from Kansas or Oklahoma. And no offense intended for those of you in those states, but people had a cooking clue about how South African names were formed. So this is a sort of I think someone has referred to this as bibliographical imperialism. And it's no fault of yours as Americans. It's just part of this great industrial military bibliographic complex which dominates the world. And I think it's an interesting aspect. It certainly has ethical dimensions to it as well.
I think of Tina's example of the children's books, that you're concerned about cataloging for academic libraries. Not only that, but that same master record then is going to go out globally too.
I would really like to see a whole set of case studies on this, because working on the Dublin Core Usage Board, of course, is an international standard that tries to facilitate cooperation internationally. And I've become acutely aware. I went to cataloging in 2007 in Iceland, and was Barbara Tillett was there to talk about RDA, but we also got to hear from a number of local librarians and their unique catalog in Iceland. And bill. But it got me very interested, and especially the small states. Right? The smaller the state, the less the resources, but the more need for assertion of sovereignty, authority, and identity in a quote global world. And I went looking for case studies, and I don't have all the languages that were required, obviously, but even with those that I do have, I couldn't find substantive examples, except for perhaps this oral history of this kind of imperialism that goes on, because I think it's very important to look at it, especially the power dynamics of resources. If we really do want to problematize industrialization, we have to look at this example as well. I think it's very, very important. But I don't have access to any of the examples, and I don't know people who do. So I would love to see people sharing that information.
I was thinking going back on.
I'm just going to ask Carol if you remember what those terms were for that were real.
I don't remember, but I'll send them out.
It would be really handy to have them because it's not just the great unwashed.
They're very well washed. They just aren't librarians.
Understand the terms of Ferber, which I think goes back to something that was raised sometime earlier in these 2 days about the limited amount of public input, user input, and professional input into the process of rules and standards creation.
Yes.
Is that you have to have a small number of people in a room when you feed them lunch and you say, make up a standard, and they make up a standard, and it makes sense to them because they've been talking to each other, and it wasn't just the sandwiches, they all had a drink together, and by the end, by the time they finished,
by the end of 2 years, you have to say, it's not just one day.
By the end of 2 years, and a whole case or three of wine, they really thought they understood what they were talking about, but nobody else does.
The wonderful example of this is the Open URL, which has the most, I was actually on that committee. It was one of the longest 2.5 years in my life, and which ended up with the terminology referent, referrer, referring entity, and a couple of other things. And someone managed to turn it into who, what, where, why, how, and it works perfectly. So yeah, we have to do the same thing.
This is why I don't speak in tags or abbreviations, because nobody understands.
Nobody understands.
Say IO or KO or anything of that sort. I know that my daughter's working as a college counselor, and she recently went to a breakfast given by a whole bunch of rather exclusive, like Harvard, Penn State, Yale, Stanford, that offered a bigger breakfast to the people who were attending, who all said, buy this tiny little donut, and they discovered that these colleges were all talking about tight economic times, but they all called it TET. It's really depressing when you have an abbreviation for tight economic times. But why in the world couldn't they just say tight economic times?
Yeah.
Why can't we say tight proper? Why can't we say information organization?
Well, an interesting thing is that Diane Hillman has observed in talks that she's given is that if you talk to catalogers about the data, they do not refer to title proper or uniform title. They use the mark tags when they speak amongst themselves.
Which at least to me is an act.
And I think that's it. I don't know what it means, but it's interesting.
Yeah, you got my gander up now. I'd like to put that sort of back in your direction, you and Karen, because none of the rest of us here are involved in standards making anymore, or I'm not any longer. But well before those people sat around in that room and made up that scheme, there was 20 years of science that would have told them, had they looked, that they had made it up incorrectly. That Ferber model was not correct. It's not a correct expression of reality about works. And then, why didn't they look that up? Why didn't they make reference to the research? I said that briefly this morning. I don't usually lash out at Ferber in public. Here I'm now. But standards-making bodies in this field never look at the research. Why?
I disclaim all responsibility for anything remotely connected.
I mean, and where do we go with that?
I don't know, but I asked that question. Actually, there was a presentation at ALA about RDA a couple of years ago, and I asked, after a presentation, I said, is any of this being based on user studies? And the answer was, you don't use user studies to create standards. From someone very involved in RDA, so.
To throw in an additional sort of factor about what I think is miscommunication that happens in the field, and it sort of relates to the acronym use of MARTET. I mean, I'm trying to think if I've ever done that, and I certainly never look at it. Which I think that, and this has to do with traditional cataloging in the context of the sort of changes that we all, I think, hope will happen, is that I think that terms like change and detailed description are sort of terms that that are so non-specific and are used in so many different ways by so many different parties that just to evoke them without any specificity can be really problematic. And I sort of alluded to this in the part of the panel, but I think that when people get involved in sort of the defense of traditional cataloging and the things that motivate them to do that, I think that it's usually a response to sort of the attempts to save money by outsourcing and abbreviating things, as opposed to the sort of attempts to actually move us ahead. And I actually want to use the example of Thomas Mann, who actually, I adore. I read his stuff. I think it's very compelling, but at the same time, maybe I'm interpreting it in a way that is not what he means. But for me, when he does his very long defenses of sort of the subject strings and subdivisions and how they lay out this array, the core of that for me is that the stuff that we're doing already. One of the access things that it does is that it presents an array of possibilities that the user doesn't have to generate themselves, and that it has a way of encoding relationships between subjects that's meaningful. And that's, I think that's all great. I think that's stuff that we need to continue to do. And I can imagine ways that we can do that are just infinitely superior to the text strings that we have now, that are so much more intuitive and usable and can be manipulated better. But I tend to see those sorts of efforts as being in defense of that capacity, rather than specifically the, depending on your view, the perfectly adequate or the completely hidebound way that we do them now. And so I guess I want to suggest that when people talk about change, that they try to actually be specific and actually delineate what they're talking about, because a lot of the sort of quicksand that we're in, I think, has to do with miscommunication along those lines.
I'm hoping you guys said that, but I think part of the issues with catalogers talking in, say, barcodes, instead of, not that it would be any less esoteric to say uniform title or title proper, I should point out. But as a young cataloger myself, but now in a professional position and working with grad assistants that I have to train instead of just work with, where we train each other, unfortunately, generally. When I tell somebody this needs a uniform title, well, do I mean it needs a 130 or a 240? When I say I'm only concerned about the title proper because that's what the new concert code says, do I really mean I care about the 245B or not? And it's far more efficient, if not necessarily ethical, from a training perspective, to say I don't care about the 245B, or at least concert doesn't care about the 245B, than to say, okay, what is your title proper elements? Think about that for a minute. Is your B part of it? So, yes, I guess I have an ethical responsibility to try not to do that, and to let them make the judgment of do I need a 130 or a 240 and so on. But often it's just far easier to talk in marked code because we can talk specifically about what we need because marked code doesn't necessarily match directly to the words we use either.
It might be sort of a keep it in the family thing.
Right.
My husband and I have been married a long time. We don't finish our sentences to each other. But when we're in public, we do. And we realized this when our adult son visited us for a while, and he said, "Don't you two ever finish your sentences?" Because he was family, so we were doing that then. So, I mean, I don't have a problem with talking mark coding if you're all catalogers together, but it's a little rude otherwise.
I think with regard to talking in mark code, and I will admit I've been unethical and I've talked mark code in front of non-catalogers when talking to another cataloger. But I think a big part of it is, and this is just a very practical human nature thing, AACR2, our cataloging codes, our standards are in their own way very esoteric and hard to understand. The application in mark is where it comes alive and where those connections are really made. So a lot of times a cataloger, even an experienced cataloger, is going to be fuzzy on uniform title. But she knows what a 130 is. She knows what a 240 is. She knows what a 245B is. Because that's what we work with on a day-to-day basis. And this talk about mark code and how jargony catalogers are, I think we need an anthropological study because we are obviously a subculture in this profession. But one thing that I've really not heard in this talk about ethics, we've talked a lot about the ethical obligations of catalogers to the users, but what I also haven't heard is the ethical obligation of public service librarians and reference librarians to information organization. You talked the other day about how catalogers need to get closer to the researcher, and I was coming at it from a very practical viewpoint of that tears me in two different directions. But there is a bridge there, and that is the subject specialist. Why does it have to be a cataloger doing the subject analysis? Why can't it be the subject specialist? Wouldn't that integrate our profession more instead of this, great divide that is not exactly a parting of the Red Sea? It's more like, parting of the... Yeah, it's more like a parting of Loch Ness, and God knows where the monster is. But, so I guess my question to not just the panel, but everyone here is, what are the ethical obligations, requirements of reference librarians, archivists, other non-catalogers to information organization? Is there one, or is it all on the hands of, catalogers who, as Tina kind of alluded to, sometimes you have to make really hard ethical choices because if you decide to give all your time to a special collection so that people worldwide can access it, like it or not, there's another special collection over here that's getting short shift.
1, 2, 3. I think I have. Please start.
Okay. Because I asked somebody, I've been asking this sort of privately around to a couple of people because I haven't even taken a cataloging course yet. I'm very new at this. And I'm going, okay, so the catalogers are like back of the house doing the cataloging, but the reference librarians are front of the house with the users. Why can't the reference librarians, and aren't they in a position to help the catalogers with what user needs are? I mean, and I'm just asking that because I'm just listening to things, and that's what I've been asking. So if anybody can help me out with that, I'd be great.
I think I don't know what the trend is now, but certainly when I was in an academic library, there was a big trend to having catalogers either sit on the reference desk or work with collections. The library that I was in tried doing it both ways, and other people coming to cataloging was a disaster.
The tribal theory of librarian.
It was called holistic librarianship. And the books were, the description was done in the catalog department by paraprofessionals, and then they were shipped out to the department libraries with subject headings to be applied. And cataloging came to a halt.
I mean, I'm not even thinking about even that formal. Don't they talk to each other?
Depends how big the library is, I think.
Terry?
I just want to say what I delineated yesterday in my presentation was not prescriptive. I think there were 3 or 4 things, and it's not a take it or leave it proposition, but it's an interesting variation on one of the themes. And any one of them or 2 or 3 of them could work locally, or again, one of the variations, any variation could work locally in any one institution.
Hope to go back to your story about you, Augusta, and we're going to have to stop talking mark tags in the halls. What you mention about when you're at home, the lingo that you have, and William Faulkner talked about this, and as I was saying, we have different languages in different places, and the languages that we use reflect the role that we're playing at any given point in time. As professionals, we have our internal role. As librarians, we have a public role, which is outside the back door. And the authorities that we appropriate affect what role we're taking at that point in time. So internally, our role is to be effective and efficient and as thorough as possible. Externally, we have a role to communicate what you haven't much addressed in your panel discussion is the trust that the public can have in the resources and the description of those resources that we're putting out there. I think that indeed the public service personnel are the people who communicate the reliability of that intellectual content to the public, but there is no one role for a professional relative to the organization. I mean, the authority that we exercise in creating the material gets communicated in a public way, and how we negotiate that is, instead of seeing us as one thing or another, to see the roles as mutable, perhaps by the person in the role at any given point.
Increasingly, though, the public services person is not in the role of guiding or interpreting because the users are bypassing the public service person entirely, so that what they see is what the people in information organization have supplied. So the issue of trust then is devolved upon information organization to try. I have no idea how to solve this problem. Is devolved then upon the information organization people, or perhaps the IT people, to help us out.
Well, that's what, is it really the IO people that are a visible face?
Yeah.
Even in remote access, it's not. You're not seeing the catalog, right? It's the interface. So where does the interface come from? Does the interface come from the profession?
That's why I was suggesting, make the catalog who cares? Can we make force that reference librarian role as an intermediator into the OPAC so that it can navigate for, now, practically speaking, could we put something in there that is advisory? I know that people don't like advisory because then it reports that we are making value judgments, and we don't want to do that. But then maybe it needs to come from the user, but we don't trust the user to provide value judgments. So in a way, you're kind of tangled up all over again just by some of the habits.
But why don't we want to make value judgments? We're the professionals. We're the public intellectuals. Why don't we make value judgments?
I also think that there's an intersection here in terms of the users between effectiveness and trust. I'm not sure whether or not they trust the library, but I think they go back to institutions that they feel are effective. So this was the whole thing of people using Google. People use Google because it has given them good results. And people have tended to go away from the library catalog, not because they think it's untrustworthy, but they find it to be ineffective. So trust alone, unfortunately, won't bring users.
And I think trusting the librarian and trusting the catalog are not the same thing. Every now and then you see a survey somebody's done about what professionals do you trust, and librarians always come out on top. And have you ever noticed that, like going through customs, if you tell them you're a librarian, I mean, the only thing that's going to slow you down is the story about the wonderful librarians they had when they were 6. You know, nobody ever looks in your bags if you're a librarian.
Or when you get pulled over by the police.
Yeah, that's another good
The other evening, had a nice long chat about the library.
But
I had a headlight on.
But the catalog is a different thing, and I think you're right. I mean, it's seen as difficult to use. I just wanted to go back for a moment to the social activism that we talked about earlier, and I think, Janet, you were saying what kind of social activism would be effective in information organization. And I thought of 2 examples, actually, and maybe somebody knows more than I do about what actually happened. One was whatever became of AACR3. And, you know, because that, and the other one, right. But, you know, how did that happen? What were the mechanisms? It would be a really interesting analysis for somebody to do to see what happens when you change the mind. I mean, has that ever happened before in our field? That some, you know, a whole text is pitched out and you start over again? That strikes me as an internal activism of the profession. And the other one is the recent OCLC issue. And it seems to me in both of those, voices were heard that aren't usually heard. So if we were to look at activism, those might be starting places to look at mosh.
Well, the same thing would apply to the LC Series Authority decision, which didn't change their mind on the Series Authority decision, but did lead to the LC working group, which I think ended up producing some extremely good, useful, long-term work. And I believe we'll end up providing LC with some both guidance and some justification for things that need to be done. But the activism was about Series Authority work, and it turned into something entirely different.
Well, and some of it doesn't work, like the whole poor people's policy to change the heading for it from poor common thought to poor people. They changed the heading, but they changed it just to poor. They just took out the thought, which was not the point of the protest for that. So whatever, that one didn't work.
Well, I think we also have an issue here. I've been involved in standards development for a while, and I have to say that I'm feeling very dismayed at the state of standards development. And since standards are so important to what we do, we have standards being developed in a number of different organizations. We have NISO, we have ISO, we have IFLA, we have Library of Congress, all developing standards. Interesting thing about NISO is, well, how many of you, your organization is a member of NISO? Yeah, right. So we all use the standards, and NISO has a terrible time getting library organizations to join to support the effort. So, you know, standards aren't free. You actually, you know, the community is going to have to contribute in order to have standards. The other thing is that the standards tend to be developed by a small number of people who are fairly elite. And what is elite about them is generally that they belong to a wealthy institution that can afford to let someone work 25% of their time for 2 to 3 years on a standard. I don't know that we've ever had someone from a public library on a standards committee. Many standards are developed in Library of Congress that, as far as I can tell, are internal and then get moved out. So there aren't, you know, wide committees that, you know, lead to them. I think we have a real issue, which if we're going to move forward in terms of technology and standards, that we need a much more egalitarian standards process. But that means that more people need to get involved and more institutions need to be willing to support it.
Doesn't that come down to institutional will, like we were talking about earlier? It means that institutions, not just individual academic libraries, but ACRL and all these have to make a commitment to say, we will support this in some, frankly, in a monetary way, in a support way, in some way. There needs to be support that I think is very lacking.
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, those are the organizations that are supporting the standards, but I can also tell you that, for example, for NISO, much of the standards work is coming from the vendors and has very little, doesn't have a great deal of library input because they're the ones who care enough to put in the time and the money. So we will get standards developed by vendors if we don't participate. Then there's the RDA issue, which is that the standards seem to have, and talked about it, I imagine it wasn't a smoke-filled room, but it was definitely a closed room. There wasn't a whole lot of community input to that, and I think that there's a process problem there, which is not unlike the OCLC policy process problem, as a matter of fact. Things happening and being sort of presented as sort of a done deal.
Well, the Joint Steering Committee for the revision of the American Cataloging Rules was created back when we were doing incremental maintenance of the existing code. And it was funded by the Committee of Principals, which consisted of the national organizations that got profits from the sale of the code. And people were appointed to that committee based upon their connection to the national committees of the Committee of Principals. And that appointment process and that membership has remained stable since I was on the JSC, which is a really long time ago now. At least 2 other representatives since me doing 6-year terms, doing 2 3-year terms each. So the appointment process and the number of people remain the same. The expertise that they're looking for remains the same as they were looking for when I was appointed to the Joint Steering Committee. And the expertise that is needed for the creation of an entirely new code or a code in these days is really rather different from what was the expertise that was needed when I was appointed. They need people who know something about systems on that committee. And they need people who know something about user studies on that committee, but they don't have them. So, but once again, it is supported by the Committee of Principals, by the people who anticipate benefiting in a profit way from the sale of the code. And one of the recommendations of the LC working group was that the code development process has got to be better supported because you can't rely on a very small group of volunteers to do your codes. And that's what we have now. It's a very small group of uncompensated volunteers devising our international standard codes.
That brings up the question of, is it ethical at all? Because it's not normative. I mean, if it's agreed upon by everyone, but it's not, it's agreed upon by this many people.
And it's imposed upon everyone else.
Well, and again, our standards tend to be either used directly or adapted in contexts for which they were designed when you look in a global sense.
Yeah.
And knowing that that's going to happen, do we have a certain ethical responsibility there as well? Okay. Why don't we shift to things that you'd like to see at future conferences? I already have the global context down and the power of groups like Thomson Scientific. Are there some other?
Looking at topics now.
Yeah.
Because we did say we wanted to invite some vendors.
Okay, well, I can put that down.
Yeah.
Oh, and I also have resource allocation.
That means inviting some library directors.
Systems designers.
How about some,
public libraries, I don't really know that I've seen
Right.
much Concord presence.
if you're talking about resource allocations for academic libraries, it goes beyond the library.
I would think any of these we need to interpret broadly. Other suggestions?
Does resource allocation include personnel issues?
I'll write that down separately just in case.
Curricular applications, and several of us are very confused.
I think especially in view of the ACES critique of the ALA code, that would be. Other things?
OPAC design.
OPAC design. All interface design.
I think it was a serious suggestion about the aesthetics.
Oh, right.
That was great.
What do we call the aesthetics and aesthetics? I'll just put aesthetics.
Role of the paraprofessionals can longer.
Okay, that would fit nicely with personnel.
Archives.
Archives. Well, I think following on from Steve's, maybe looking at archives and museums and other contexts. Karen?
I've thought about this off and on the past couple of days, and maybe it's been brought up a few times in bits and pieces. Somehow taking the whole concept of ethics back with you to your home institution, how to do that, how to play out ethics on a day-to-day basis, not just individually, but bring it back to your institution so that everyone gets on board with it.
That might
Define an institution to be vendor as well as library.
Sure, we can throw vendors in there too.
Does anybody have thoughts on that since you're going to be going back at some point? I think it's a very good point. I mean, because if all we do is get together periodically and talk to each other, that
I think it's worth talking about because it's very difficult to connect to know how to bring up the discussion of ethics without seeming like a break.
okay, you ethicists in the room. How do you bring up ethics?
No, I just think the curriculum is for me important, but also the practical application in the field work, or as we see about diversity, the same should apply with ethics. Because we talked about our school, like diversity should actually be included in the curriculum, in every curriculum. It shouldn't just be who you appoint or your student body. It should be what you teach in every single course. And I think the ethical dimension should be the same. We should be ethical, treat our students ethical. Students should be ethical, but in your curriculum across the board, it should the ethical component should be integrated.
One of the things I saw recently, I wish Ed were still here, Brown, Tennessee, did some work looking at ways of incorporating LGBT issues into the curriculum. And I think the same can be done for ethics and a number of other, just practical strategies, which is one way to bring it back at least to an academic context.
What we also discussed, because last year we did ethics in I didn't say ethics in Hawaii, I think for the next year we did ethics in IR, information retrieval. These are two such close components, information organization and information retrieval. We might add that as a dimension at the next conference.
Well, with that, I think we will close.
I just want to say a few words of thanks. I think it's just, I'll just stand there. I want to thank everybody at our Janet's notion. I will call this the MARC conference. That means the moral analysis of records in catalogs. I thought it was an extremely successful conference. I've learned a lot from people. I thought we linked theory and practice. I thought we linked information organization and ethics. And I also thought we linked people. And it has been a long time since I have attended a conference on a long weekend, on a Friday and on a Saturday with about 100% attendance. I must admit, I thought this morning I picked up Peter and I had to put in gas in my car because it was empty. So we came 5 minutes later and said, that'll be no problem. And I was very surprised when I saw a lot of people, the same as yesterday. I cannot recall a conference that was so well attended and that people actually participated in the way everybody did here. So on behalf of the school, I would like to thank you, everybody who came from many places around the country, and from Canada and from other places in the world. And we are looking forward to the next conference. Hope loves information organization. I love ethics, and that's why we love to work together. So on that note, I would like to thank you all. Thank you.